If our real interest is true justice, that means we need to be talking about God's justice. Not justice as our world talks about it or thinks about it, but justice as God does.
Welcome to another Prepare to Answer podcast. My name is Sean Walker. I'm joined as always by Scott Steen. How are you, Scott?
Good. How are you, Sean?
Good. So we are tackling the topic of social justice, and we're still within our cancel culture series. But Scott, maybe you can explain what we're going to be looking at when we're looking at social justice.
Well, broadly speaking today, it's kind of flowing out of our last conversation around free speech, just realizing under this whole umbrella of cancel culture, all of these kind of public discussions, public debates, center around so many issues around our rights as citizens, the way we treat one another, the way we expect other people to treat us, all those kinds of things. So social justice is just a whole part of that bigger discussion, and is such a concern in our culture right now, where so many seem to be especially in the younger generation, so many concerned about issues around justice. That it's a conversation that's happening all the time. And it's happening, in the church, not surprisingly, and rightly so. And in fact, there have been numerous studies, Barna's done a number of them, just to even demonstrate that, particularly among millennial and Gen Z Christians, unlike their parents' generations and generations before, they have a real interest and concern in areas of justice within society. And rightly so. Our interest today, Sean, is really to dive into it, to ensure that as Christians, as we're talking about social justice, as we're looking to do social justice, that we ensure that we are understanding all of the issues, as always our goal here at Prepare to Answer, is to understand these things from a biblical lens, a biblical worldview. That whatever the subject happens to be, God's word speaks to it. And we always want God's truth to inform our understanding, so that when we're engaging with the world, when we're talking about these things, when we're acting, that we're doing so according to God's truth, and not mistakenly adopting maybe views of the culture that don't align with God's truth. So that's, broadly speaking, that's kind of our concern for the day.
Sure. And would you say that this episode is sort of a foundational episode, as we're going to start diving into some topics that we need a foundation about what social justice is from a biblical standpoint?
Yeah, sure. Because we're going to, as we continue on our cancel culture series, we're going to talk about issues, in our world, our world's concerned around things related to, diversity and equity and inclusion. All of those subjects really fall under this, this broader theme of social justice. They're justice issues. And so, this is a good foundation to lay for what's going to come after, for sure.
Yeah. So we'd encourage our listeners to take this episode in. This will be foundational. We're going to lay some foundations for those discussions that we will go back to when we talk about these issues as we move along. And I'd also encourage our listeners to go back to some of our previous episodes on cancel culture. You can find them on our website, preparetoanswer.org. You can also find them on YouTube, Spotify, Apple iTunes. So let's jump in, Scott. Social justice. Yeah. Where do we start?
Yeah, well, let's just warm up the discussion, Sean. Let's get our own minds warmed up here. When I say social justice, everybody has, it's such a prolific discussion in our culture. Everybody's got their own ideas. When I say social justice to you, what's the knee jerk? What pops into your head? What kind of ideas or images pop into your head?
Sure. And when it's social justice, the first thing that pops into my head would be social justice warrior. So activists, those out protesting on the street, really almost militant, which is interesting. I was thinking about that the other day. Social justice spans all time. And if we look back to the 60s, it would probably best be in hippies. But nowadays, it seems a little more militant. And that's kind of my thoughts on it, at least when someone says social justice.
Yeah, well, certainly there's a lot to that in terms of because views in our society are becoming so polarized.
Yeah.
I think we've lost the common ground on which we can have reasoned discussions on very important issues related to things around justice and equality and all those things. And once you lose the ground upon which to have reasoned discussion, the only thing that's left is, advocacy. We're really just kind of shouting.
Sure.
Right.
Yes. That's what it feels like. Yes.
Right. And I mean, I want to be careful, Sean, because I think you used the term social justice warrior, and that's certainly something that pops into my head too. But I think that's partly we have to be careful, as with so many other discussions, of our tendency to we put a label on something. The social justice warrior is used pejoratively, right? That's used as soon as you say, oh, you're just a social justice warrior, that's dismissive, right? It immediately dismisses whatever the person happens to be arguing for or advocating for. So I think, it just reminds me of how wrapped up this is in the broader dynamics around cancel culture that we've been discussing, of this breakdown of our ability to find common ground in culture together to work through these things.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of people are really interested in it, though. Like nowadays, it is something that people are very tuned into, at least.
For sure. It's hard to watch a news broadcast or listen to any kind of, media personalities talking these days that isn't touching on some issue related to social justice. Broadly, everybody is interested in justice. I think as Christians, we ought to be as well. We just need to make sure that we're thinking clearly, and especially thinking biblically. But I think a good place to start, where I always like to start, Sean, is just defining the terms and getting an understanding. The dictionary is often a good place to start. It doesn't resolve things, but at least it gives us a starting point. Yeah. Especially I think, as Christians, we want to learn to think biblically. But I think part of that is learning to listen to and understand the way the people around us in our world think, how they understand things, which is why, I remember James saying, be quick to listen and slow to speak. Proverbs says that it's, to speak before listening is shame and folly. So we need to be people who learn to listen and understand the world around us and the people in it who we're seeking to reach. So, I went to the dictionary and I just started with, how does our world think about justice? The dictionary is just a good place to find some common ground. Here's two definitions I looked up. One was social justice and the other was just justice proper. So here's what Oxford says about social justice. It defines social justice, it's the noun, social justice is the fair distribution of wealth and opportunities within society, which I thought was interesting. So I think the operative word being in that definition is the term fair. Interestingly, looking at the word justice, also in the Oxford Dictionary, the general term justice is defined this way: the quality of being fair or reasonable. So I think the operative word there in our dictionary definitions around justice, social justice or justice, is the whole notion of fairness.
Which is almost ingrained in us right from childhood. That's not fair. That's not fair.
Yeah. I don't know how many times as a parent I heard that from my kids. That's not fair.
Not fair. That's right. Yes. But then that raises the question, what is fair?
And that's often what I would ask my kids. Well, what's fair? That would drive them bananas. What is fair? Fair is me getting my way. No.
Yes.
But you're exactly right.
Right.
What is often the case when you go to the dictionary is dictionaries define terms using other terms, and then you realize, we need to now define the terms being used to define the terms. What is fair?
Yes.
What does fair mean? So it's not the most helpful. It certainly doesn't clarify anything for us because it raises more questions about how we determine fairness. Maybe a slightly more helpful definition of justice is one that's been around for centuries and centuries. really shaping our understanding of justice in the West, going all the way back to really this goes all the way back to like the 6th century. But I would argue it goes further back than that. In fact, one of the books that we've looked at together, Sean, looking at this whole area of justice, is a book by Thaddeus Williams called Confronting Injustice. And it's an excellent book in terms of helping us understand a biblical understanding of justice. But it's very comprehensive, so it covers much more than what we're going to talk about today. Just certainly, I would recommend it to our viewers and our listeners as a resource. And we'll have that in the comments section of this episode. But Thaddeus Williams says, here is the definition of justice that has been around. He says it's been around for millennia, really going as far back as really, ancient Greece. This is actually the definition in the Institutes of Justinian, which was he was a 6th century emperor of Rome.
Okay.
Actually in the Eastern Roman Empire. But here's how he defined it. He said, justice is the set and constant purpose which gives to every man or every person, man or woman, his or her due. In other words, justice is giving the other person what is due them.
Almost what they're owed. Would that be another way to say that?
Yeah. Or another word we could use is what they are entitled to. And I don't mean entitled in the terms that we often mean it of entitled. We're living in an era of entitlement where everybody feels entitled to everything. But people are entitled to some things. And the things that people are entitled to, justice means ensuring that they receive or they get what they're entitled to. But anyway, there is the working definition. There's a good working definition that justice is making sure that everyone gets what is due them. But Sean, that raises another question. What's the obvious question?
What are people due?
And what is that? I know.
Are we answering any questions today?
No, we're just asking more and more questions. Right. No, that's what we're trying to do is we're trying to drill down to, if we're really going to understand justice, what is the really fundamental question that we have to ask and answer?
Exactly.
And I think starting with the definitions and we're going through this exercise of realizing we're defining, but our definings are forcing us to ask even more basic questions.
Sure.
And as we answer those, at some point we need to get to our foundation, where we begin from.
Right.
What's really interesting, that question, so what are people due? I was reading an interview done with Michael Sandel, who is, he's a really well-known American philosopher. He teaches philosophy. He's a philosophy scholar at Harvard University. In fact, I watched some of his, for one of my kids, their law course, they had to watch some of his first-year philosophy lectures that were recorded. They were on YouTube. They were produced. They were done in this really cool lecture hall at Harvard. They were really excellent. I watched a couple of them. Again, I'm geeking out here. I watch philosophy lectures for fun. Anyway, he's a really brilliant man. I really appreciate his perspectives on things. He's not a Christian as far as I understand, but he was being interviewed, and in the interview, he brought up this same definition. And he said, the working definition for time immemorial in terms of Western thought has been that justice means giving the other person what theirs due. I was going back to the 6th century with the Institutes of Justinian. Sandel points all the way back to Aristotle. He says this goes all the way back to Aristotle. And he said, broadly speaking, we've inherited 3 main ways of answering that question. So you raised the question. The question's obvious, right? Well, what are people due?
Sure.
He says we've been trying to answer this for centuries, and boiled down to there's probably 3 main ways that we in the West have sought to answer the question. And the 3 he names are, he talks about utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham really was the philosopher back in the 18th century who kind of put this principle together. Utilitarianism says that justice is maximizing the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Right. The second one that Sandel points out is the principle of human dignity. It goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant. And Kant wanted to say that, justice is based on the fact that all human beings are worthy of dignity. There is something inherent to humanity that merits dignity to each individual, right? And so he would not subscribe to utilitarianism. He would say, no. Justice is treating people according to the dignity that they are due as human beings. And then the third one that Sandel points out is that of virtue, he says this was Aristotle's view, that people deserve to be treated according to their virtue, according to basically to their character. So he would say, so a good person, a person who possesses the virtue of goodness, deserves to be treated with goodness. An evil person, right? Someone with the virtue or the lack of virtues, or someone who's evil, deserves, right, I guess, punishment or whatever for being an evil person. So that's kind of how he framed it. And generally, Sean, I would say we're familiar with all three. We're not philosophers, right? And I don't expect our listeners are versed in philosophy. Maybe some of them are. So names like Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham and Aristotle might not mean anything to many people. But we are all familiar with the ideas. That's the thing I find really interesting. Even if we're not, students of philosophy, we're all impacted by these ideas. And I think here's a good way just to demonstrate that, Sean, and this will be let's do a little thought experiment. I want to take us down the rabbit hole. Let's do a thought experiment. Yeah. So here's a hypothetical scenario where we're going to try and determine what justice is. So imagine that a terrorist has hidden a bomb somewhere. It's going to go off. This is like the storyline of I don't know how many action movies.
That's right.
There's a terrorist. They've hidden a bomb. This is a terrible person, right? Yeah. Thousands of people are going to die if this bomb is not found and disarmed, right? But here's the scenario. The only way to get the information that we need out of this terrorist in time to save all those people who will be killed or injured by the bomb is to torture the terrorist. We have to perform acts of torture on this person in order to extract the information we need to save all those lives. So, Sean, you are in charge. You're in charge. So what do?
I call in Matlock or Columbo. I'm sure.
Oh, man. Are you ever dating yourself? Matlock.
He always got to the bottom of things without having to torture anyone.
How old are you anyway, Sean?
He was super old.
Yes. What would you say? What would you say?
Yeah.
Well, I would be interested to know what our viewers and thinkers would say.
Yeah. So without Matlock or Columbo, I mean, it bumps up to exactly what we're talking about, right? So utilitarianism would say we torture the terrorist because that would be the best thing because it saves the most amount of people. But then the terrorist is a person. They have their own rights and dignity and things like that. And so it's not right to torture someone, even if it could mean saving lots of lives. So yeah, it really is a difficult question.
Well, you've certainly surfaced the tensions, but you haven't given me an answer. Let's do it. Okay, let's just we'll put it on the table. Nobody thinks torture is good, right? No one's going to say the right thing to do or the good thing to do is to torture, but those are the options: thousands of lives lost or torture. So which way would you lean?
Yeah, I would lean to torture, honestly, if that's, and I might get some comments about that, but it saves lots of lives. Yeah. Well, Sean, It's been great having you part of the Prepared to Answer organization. I'm just not sure it's working out. I'm not sure this is going to work out. It was a good run. Sure. I'm sure there are people, what, this reminds me of so many, my first year university ethics courses. These are the kinds of hypotheticals that teachers used to use to get students to think through the issues. And even we see it in modern media and in fact, the other night I was watching the show Jack Ryan. Hopefully it's not a spoiler alert. So there's a terrorist bomb in a hospital that the president was in. And the question is, do you evacuate the hospital or do you evacuate the president first? Which is more important? Because to evacuate the whole hospital would mean the president wouldn't be able to evacuate. And so there was a debate.
Yeah,
and
there's another classic example. Yeah, that's a classic example. It shows up all the time. Another great example is, I don't know if you're a Batman fan, Sean, but if we go back to The Dark Knight, which was like 2008, it's a bit of an older movie, but the end of The Dark Knight, like Joker somehow sets up this scenario, this no-win scenario where two New York ferries, right, go out into the harbor and then stop. And then it turns out they're all wired to blow. And he's given each of the other ferries the trigger to the other ferry's bomb and basically said, your choice is to blow up the other one, or at midnight, I blow up everybody, right? So it's this, so you see the same dynamics going on. Okay, let's go back to our thought experiment for a second, because I'm sure that people are familiar with this. I'm sure they've gone through their mind, and they're probably saying, you know what? Yeah, if those were my only two options, the lesser evil would be torturing the terrorists to get information. Okay, let's add a different variable now to the scenario. Now, the only way to get information out of this terrorist, because they're just a mad person who won't give up information no matter how much we torture them, the only way to get information out of them would be to torture their 6-year-old child.
Yeah, makes it a lot more difficult. Doesn't it?
And why is that?
Because now it's definitely a virtue problem. This 6-year-old had nothing to do with what her father.
Yeah, this is an innocent child. It was one thing when we were talking about this evil terrorist, right? Who's guilty, who's trying to kill people. Well, that's a little more easy to swallow, but an innocent child who has. Right, so there's the virtue principle coming into play. So you know what? Even though if we haven't read all those philosophers of old, we're familiar with the arguments. Those are kind of the three main ones that, we in the West, in our secular culture, when we're working through issues of justice, social justice or whatever, those are the three principles that tend to come in play. Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to go through that exercise just to, first of all, to illustrate for our listeners and our viewers to realize we were familiar with those. We went through that mental exercise, and I think it wasn't foreign to us. We've watched it played out in so many movies, as you just illustrated, Sean, with TV shows and all the rest. So it's very familiar to us. Yeah. And so here's the thing I want to be, I guess, aware of, though, as Christians, is the degree to which the way our culture thinks about discussions of justice influences the way we think about it. And here's the challenge with all three of those, and really any other, I guess, secular philosophical attempt to find a grounding or a basis for answering that question, what are people do? And the problem is, it's something that sociologist Charles Taylor, he identified the problem, and he referred to it as the problem is that of the immanent frame.
Okay. What does that mean?
So the immanent frame, when he's talking about the immanent frame, he means that the immanent frame is a way of looking at the world, looking at the universe, that sees the universe or the world as a closed box, right? You think about if there's a box, and inside the box is the entire universe, right? All matter and space and energy, everything that exists in the universe is inside the box. And what the immanent frame is built on is the idea that, so there's that closed box, so that whatever our basis for justice is, if we're going to find one, the only place we can look for it and find it is somewhere inside the box, right?
Yep.
It's immanent. Mm-hmm. That means it's in our, I guess, in our world. That's where we're looking to find that that bottom basement foundational principle upon which we can build an unshakable answer, right? A certain answer or a universal answer for the question. Well, how do we determine what people are due?
Yeah. What is fair? What are people due?
Right.
Yeah, all those questions.
Right. Those questions we posed at the beginning, right? The problem, though, the problem with the immanent frame is, and this is, I'm going to quote Thaddeus Williams again, he identifies it. He says, the problem, though, is that the immanent frame is that nothing inside the box grounds equality or dignity or value. There's nothing in the box that can serve as a universal ground point for dignity, equality, value for all people. And I think you can see this is true just by let's look at those three main ways that our culture has used, through centuries to answer the question, right? Utilitarianism, Sean, is the idea that, what people are due is whatever will maximize the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Right. Well, what's the obvious shortcoming there?
Right. What happens if that maximizing the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people deprives me of my happiness? That doesn't seem fair.
Well, sure. Or to flip it around, what if maximizing my happiness or even maximizing the happiness for the greatest number of people requires depriving the happiness of the minority, right? And I mean, we can see that worked out in history. We just have to go back to, even Nazi Germany to see that principle in play in the most horrific way possible. You can bet that utilitarian justification was part of the Nazi rationalizing process.
And the rise to power.
Right, which led to horrific evils. So, I mean, so that's the problem is there's no ground, right? So utilitarianism fails. What about virtue?
So what is virtuous? What are those virtues that we are seeking out? And classically, says who?
Yeah.
Why do you think that that's a virtue, right? Why do you get to define what a virtue is? Yeah.
Well, which virtues? That's exactly which virtues, who gets to choose? You're right. And what standard? And then how does that then justify, I guess, depriving maybe people who aren't virtuous of justice, or does it?
Sure.
Okay. Now, the third one that might seem the most familiar or plausible to us would be Kant's idea of human dignity, that there's something inherent to humanity that entitles each person to dignity. But again, the question that raises, though, Sean, is what is it that we're rooting dignity in? Now Kant, he wanted to root it in the notion that, humanity, unique from any other living being in the world, humanity possesses the power of rationality, of reason, right? Which is he was part of the whole Enlightenment movement of this kind of seeking to anchor human knowledge and truth in reason. And he saw that with our possession of reason, humanity and humanity alone is able to make real life choices. And by virtue of that, that quality, therefore all human beings are inherently worthy of dignity, right? Regardless of their virtue, regardless of utilitarian principles. And we might say, well, yeah, that seems like something we can ground it in. Now here's the problem, though. Even in rooting it in something as seemingly universal as human reason, we have to acknowledge and recognize that reason varies in capacity.
Sure it does.
Right? Yeah. And so what does that then do for, the mentally incapable? Those who can't make reason-based decisions for themselves. What does it say for the unconscious, right? For the person in the hospital bed who's alive, but in a coma. and there's no reasoning going on. Was it safe for very, very young children, infants?
Sure. Yeah.
And of course, what does it say for the unborn? So even in trying to find some kind of universal human quality in the immanent frame, eventually it breaks down for someone.
Mm-hmm. So as we're talking, Scott, what I find is as we're drilling down to find a foundation, we're not finding anything here.
Right. Not within the immanent frame.
Right.
And I think what we have to realize as Christians, again, it's not as though no laws that aren't made from a Christian, from a Christian worldview, can't somehow achieve justice for people. But I think what we have to recognize is that ultimately they're all based on an ultimate foundation that can't be. It's not stable. It can't universally supply dignity and equality and value to every human being in terms of giving each person what they're due. At some point it breaks down. And this is why as Christians, I think we need to think carefully about this, Sean, about how we ground justice. Because oftentimes we get Christians can become very zealous about justice. We go to the Bible and we see, the multitude of verses like Micah 6:8 that says, and what does the Lord require of you, speaking to God's people, to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And so, the person who's zealous about whatever particular, subject around justice or social justice quotes the verse and says, there you go. We need to behave we need to do justice. We need to therefore get behind this or that or the other, a cause or position or whatever.
And we're not saying that that's a bad thing. We're not saying that that's a bad thing, right?
Well, what I'm saying is that there's the tendency to be zealous for justice, as we should be, look to God's word to affirm our need to be just, which it does, and which we should be. But then failing to realize that what we're doing is we're taking our notion of justice that's been framed by our culture, that's been grounded in the immanent frame that Taylor talked about, right? That will ultimately fail in delivering true justice, true biblical justice. And that's the risk, that's the danger. And so that as Christians, that I think what we want to be just aware of, or what we want to be conscious of, is that if our real interest is true justice, that means we need to be talking about God's justice. Not justice as our world talks about it or thinks about it, but justice as God does, right? That's where we need to start. And if our working definition of justice stands, and I think it's still a good one, right? Giving the other what they are due, then determining, right, God's basis, the biblical basis for justice means starting with asking the question, not what does the other person do, but what does God do? What is due to God first?
Yes.
From there, then we have our foundation from which to proceed and determine how we then act justly in the world.
So then a great question would be then, what does God do? It's interesting, Scott, we're really shifting here, right? We're thinking kind of on our plane, but it feels like we've taken a real turn here. And now we're thinking vertically as opposed to horizontally.
Well, and I think that's the challenge so often, Sean, is as Christians, is that we fail to realize just how countercultural our thinking is in absolutely every way, in every sphere of thought. That all of our ideas, I mean, Solomon said it best. Here's how he put it. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. Anything that we seek to know and understand in this world begins with God. Sure. That's just, as Christians, we need to hard bake that into our minds and our understanding. And that's true of justice also. Now, you asked the obvious question. You asked the right question. So then, okay, if that's where we start, then what does God do? And where we go, we look to Scripture and we just see what Scripture tells us about who God is and what he's due. Who is he? I mean, ultimately, he's our creator, right? Sure. God is the one who created all that is. As Paul says in Romans 11, all things are from him and through him and to him. It's all for him. And he says later in Colossians 1 that, Jesus, who is the image of God, all things were created through him and for him. The earth is the Lord's, right? And everything in it.
Right.
So that's who God is. He's our creator. He said about us, let us make mankind in our image, right? God's the creator. God's the one. He's the one who's made everything. It's for him. Who are we? We are the ones he's made to reflect his image, to reflect his glory back to him. And so that means then that what is due to God is ultimately our worship. God deserves our worship, where worship is defined not just as singing on Sundays or taking a walk in the park. Worship is defined as the devotion of all of our living intention and energy and outcome. Okay, as Paul put it in Romans 12, to offer ourselves, our lives, our bodies as a living sacrifice. So that's life encompassing, that everything about us is for God. That's worship. So we do what is right or just to God. We give God what he is due when we fulfill God's created purpose for us, of bearing his image, of fulfilling his will. The word that the Bible uses in the Old Testament is, the Hebrew word is tzedek, which is righteousness. Sometimes it's used, it's referred to as justice. But here's Deuteronomy 6. This is, Deuteronomy is the founding document for the law for Israel in the first 5 books of the Bible. This is Moses bringing the law to Israel. At Deuteronomy 6:25, here's what Moses writes. He says, and if we are careful to obey all this law, he's just gone through listing a whole bunch of the laws and the statutes that God is giving his people. If we're careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness. Okay, that will be our tzedek. So we do justice to God. We're righteous when we accomplish God's will. And I think where this is reflected so clearly in Jesus' life and his words, particularly in his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's about to go to the cross and he's facing the reality of that suffering for our sin, and he asks the Lord, if Father, if this cup of suffering can be taken from me, then would you please take it? But he finally then says, but not my will, but yours be done. Right. And that's in Luke 22:42, right? That is giving God his due.
Right. So then how does this relate to social justice then? Like if we can pull it back to our initial question.
Yeah. Okay. So there are 2 words in particular in the Old Testament used frequently together and often synonymously in Scripture when talking about justice. The one is the one I just mentioned, which is the Hebrew word tzedek, which translated directly is righteousness. And that carries the meaning of being righteous or being just. Timothy Keller referred to it as kind of primary, that is primary justice, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's living in right relationship toward God and toward others, giving God and giving others what is due to them. That is being, that's tzedek, that's being righteous. There's another word, mishpat, which carries the meaning of really making a right judgment. It's often translated directly as bringing justice. And what Keller defined kind of the meaning it carries with it more is that of rectifying justice. In other words, punishing wrongdoers according to their crime or caring for the victims of injustice. Right. And in the New Testament, it comes around to, God sees true religion as caring for orphans and widows, right? Those who are treated unjustly by society in general. And there's a lot to that, I think. So those are the 2 words that are most often used. And, you see them all throughout Scripture over and over again, particularly the Old Testament, used together. For instance, in Job 37:23, the Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice, mishpat, and great righteousness, tzedek, right? Justice and righteousness, he does not oppress. Here's Psalm 33:5, the Lord loves righteousness, that's the tzedek, and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love. Over and over again, and ultimately then in Isaiah 9, talking about the Messiah, God declares that the Messiah will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness. And of course, he's talking about the coming of King Jesus, who will rule in justice and righteousness. So, So I think, your question was, what does this have to do with social justice? Think about it in terms of God's commandments, Sean. Particularly, I think about Jesus' words when Jesus was confronted by the religious leaders in Matthew 22. And they asked, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, right? Love God, right? Basically, give all of your being to God. That's the first and greatest commandment. But he doesn't stop there. He says, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Yep. And so when you look at how God's commandments, when his commands regarding righteousness and justice and fulfilling his purpose and his will for us, when you look at how God's law is laid out, there's this the notion of how we give God his due and how we give others their due. You can't pull them apart.
No.
It's like asking the question, Sean, what does God want more? Does he want you to love him more or other people more? What would he rather you do?
Yeah. So by loving him, in essence, you're loving others. It's almost one and the same.
Well, when we love him, right, we will love others. And you're right. So how is it that we show our love for God? Well, it's in how we love his image bearers. Right?
Sure. Yep.
The ones who the God who we seek to love, who is unseen, right? How do we love him in a way that's concrete and tangible and real? Well, we simply have to look at the person next to us who bears the image of the one we can't see, who is visible. And when we love the image bearer, that is in effect an act of love for the one whose image they bear.
I really liked a line that you had said earlier in the podcast. And I think it went something like, if our pursuit is for real justice, it needs to be God's justice. But Scott, I wanted to go back to our thought experiment. So we had done our thought experiment about the terrorists and the bomb in the school and whether we torture them or not. And we really deconstructed secular justice in light of that thought experiment. Can we go back to that now that we've looked at what we would define as biblical justice? Can we run through that thought experiment and see where, after this discussion of biblical justice, where we would land in that situation? Is that fair?
Well, I think it's not only fair, it's probably the most honest thing to do.
Sure. So again, the situation is you're in front of a terrorist that if you tortured them and or their daughter, that you might be able to get that information to save the thousands of people's lives in that school. So if we were to look to biblical justice, how best would we proceed in that situation?
Well, I think, boy, I don't think there's any way of answering this that's going to make anyone happy. But our interest is in being people who are just, who are righteous, who are right with God, right before God, and act rightly toward others. And I think in that horrible scenario, the question is, so would we torture the terrorist in order to potentially save the thousands of lives? If we're applying the principle of biblical justice that we've surfaced, which is that we give God his due by treating people as his image bearers. The utilitarian argument would say, well, you could mistreat one image bearer to potentially save thousands of image bearers, right? That's the utilitarian argument could come into play there. But I think there's another aspect of biblical justice that we always have to keep in mind, Sean. And that is that the sovereignty of God. That God is sovereign over the affairs of man in history, and that we aren't. And so it's tempting for us in a scenario like that to say, well, what we need to do is we need to really take on God's prerogative to ensure the best outcome, no matter what the cost, through whatever means. And I think, again, leaning on the utilitarian kind of argument, and I think that's a really dangerous place to go, because it then starts to justify. So in a case like this, we're going to actually not give an image bearer their due, or actually, abuse an image bearer, torture an image bearer, in order to potentially, in order to bring about an outcome that ultimately is in God's hands. I think in that case, I don't think as Christians we could torture someone. I think to do so would be to saying, I'm justifying sin in order to bring about an outcome that I view or deem to be, basically worth it. And I don't think God ever calls us to that. I've never seen God anywhere command sin in order to bring about a righteous outcome.
Right.
So from a Christian justice standpoint, in that really hypothetical thought experiment, no, I don't think we could perform torture. I think we could and should pursue persuasion by every possible means short of that.
That's right. Bring in Matlock.
And seek, by whatever other means to try and safeguard the people who might be exposed to that. We try to do everything within our power, short of sinning, short of disobeying God's command. Yeah, I think that's probably the safest place to land. Even though I know there are going to be people who will probably be saying, so in other words, you're saying it's okay that all those people are going to die. No, I'm not. I'm not saying that's okay. It's horrible. It's horrible. But ultimately, I have to leave things in this world that are out of my control in the hands of my sovereign God who is in control. And I have to always, through the eyes of faith, trust that will not the Lord of all the universe do what is right? And I'll trust that, yes, he will.
Yeah. And while that's not satisfying, like you said, Scott, what I do like about it is it then focuses us where we need to have our focus, which is on God.
Yeah. Right. I'll just say, Sean, it's not satisfying in terms of our kind of ingrained need to ensure outcomes. But I think it's just a good reminder that we can control our behaviors, we can control our actions. We can't control the outcomes of them. That's not our prerogative. That's not within our power. We try to, and usually when we try to, we make a horrible mess.
That's right. Yep, so true. We will be coming back to some of these principles, right, Scott, in the next few episodes as we start diving into some other social justice, cancel culture issues. Some of the things that we've talked about today are fairly foundational. If you have any questions about what we've talked about today, or even want to just talk even more, email us at info@preparedtoanswer.org. Visit us on our website, preparedtoanswer.org. And until next time, God bless.